Let's kick off this explainer by throwing you right into the deep end. Picture this. You're the driver of a runaway trolley car. Your brakes are completely shot, and you are flying down the tracks at 60 miles an hour. Right in your path, there are 5 track workers. You know without a shadow of a doubt that if you hit them, they're all going to die. You're panicking, feeling totally helpless. But then, you spot something out of the corner of your eye.
There's a side track breaking off to the right. And on that track, there's just one single worker. Now, your steering wheel, it actually still works. So you're suddenly staring down this incredibly heavy choice. You can stay the course, go straight, and kill the 5 workers. Or you can turn the wheel, effectively killing that one single worker, but sparing the 5. So what on earth is the right thing to do here?
Well, when you ask people this, you get a massive, undeniable consensus. The vast majority of people say, yeah, turn the wheel. And the logic is pretty straightforward, right? It's horribly tragic, but the guiding principle is simply that it is better to lose one life so that 5 others can keep theirs. It's that classic greater good math we apply all the time, especially when looking back at historical tragedies. The idea that sacrificing a few to save many is just the terrible but right call. But let's see how sturdy that principle actually is. Let's run a second scenario. This time, you're not driving. You are just a bystander standing on a bridge right above the tracks. The trolley is barreling toward those same 5 workers, but this time, leaning over the bridge right next to you is a very, very heavy man. You realize in a split second, you could just give him a shove. He'd fall onto the track, and sadly, he would die, but his sheer weight would completely stop the trolley and save those 5 workers. And just like that, the consensus totally vanishes. Suddenly, almost nobody wants to push the man. But why? Why is it perfectly acceptable to trade 1 life for 5 in the first setup, but it feels like straight-up murder in the second? It really comes down to a categorical difference in how we're involved. We somehow easily excuse the passive act of steering a machine in a situation where everyone is kind of already in danger. But our brains completely short-circuit and recoil at the active, physical, conscious act of shoving a totally innocent bystander to his death with our own 2 hands. Actually, we can see this exact same tension if we get out of the trolley yard entirely. Imagine you're an ER doctor. 6 patients roll in from a massive car wreck. You've got a choice. You can spend your entire shift saving 1 severely injured patient, which means the 5 moderately injured ones are going to pass away. Or you flip it. You save the 5 moderately injured folks, but let the severely injured ones slip away. Unsurprisingly, almost everyone instantly chooses to save the 5. It's that exact same math again, 5 lives over 1. Okay, but let's tweak the variables one more time. You're a transplant surgeon now. You have 5 patients, and they will absolutely die today if they don't get 5 different organs. You have 0 donors, but right down the hall, there's a totally healthy guy taking a nap after coming in for a routine checkup. You could sneak in, take his organs, which obviously kills him and completely ruins his day, but you'd save your 5 dying patients. Are you going to do it? Of course not. Literally nobody thinks that's the right move. So where did our neat little 5 versus 1 math go? These totally conflicting reactions perfectly highlight our first major philosophical framework for this explainer: consequentialist moral reasoning. It's exactly what it sounds like. It locates morality entirely in the consequences of an action. The most famous version of this is utilitarianism, which was dreamed up by the 18th century English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham basically said, look, humans are driven by pleasure and pain. Therefore, the most moral thing you can possibly do is maximize overall utility, meaning you bump up the happiness and minimize the suffering. The greatest good for the greatest number of people, period. On the flip side, that visceral, sickening hesitation you felt about pushing the guy off the bridge or carving up the napping patient, that points to a totally different camp: categorical moral reasoning. This was championed by another 18th century heavyweight, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that some actions are just intrinsically, fundamentally wrong, no matter how amazing the consequences might be. For him, morality isn't a math problem. It's about absolute duties and unshakable fundamental human rights. And honestly, this right here is the core conflict we're wrestling with. You really have to look in the mirror and ask, are you fundamentally a utilitarian, crunching the numbers to find the greatest good? Or do you believe in absolute, hardline human rights that you cannot violate under any circumstances, even if breaking them would save 100 other people? Now, when you hit these massive philosophical walls, it is super tempting to just shrug and embrace skepticism. Tell yourself, hey, if the world's greatest thinkers couldn't solve this, I'm certainly not going to. But Kant had a great response to that.
He said, skepticism is a fine resting place for human reason, but it is absolutely no dwelling place for permanent settlement. Why? Because we can't just opt out. We are literally living out the answers to these impossible dilemmas every single day in the laws we pass, the policies we support, and the choices we make.
So let's take these lofty theoretical frameworks and drop them into a terrifying real-world survival situation. We're going to look at a harrowing 19th century British court case, the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens. This involves the survivors of a shipwrecked yacht called the Mignonette. And this isn't a thought experiment. This is a true story that forces us to test these principles in a literal life-or-death pressure cooker.
The sheer horror of this case plays out over 20 agonizing days. The Mignonette sinks in the South Atlantic, a massive 1,300 miles from the nearest land. 4 men managed to escape in a tiny lifeboat. Their entire supply stash? 2 cans of turnips. 0 fresh water. They stretch these rations as long as humanly possible, even catching a turtle at one point, but soon they're totally out of food. Fast forward to day 19. The cabin boy, a 17-year-old orphan named Richard Parker, is lying at the bottom of the boat, incredibly sick from drinking seawater. Captain Dudley floats the idea of drawing lots, a lottery to decide who dies so the rest can live. Another crew member, Brooks, flat out refuses. So, no lottery. But then, on day 20, with no rescue ship in sight, Captain Dudley says a prayer, tells the sick boy his time has come, and uses a penknife to slit his jugular vein so the other 3 men can literally feed on his body. For 4 incredibly grim days, the 3 remaining men fed on the boy. And then they were finally rescued. Captain Dudley actually wrote about the rescue in his diary, and he used this staggering, almost chilling euphemism. He wrote, "On the 24th day, as we were having our breakfast, a ship appeared at last. They were scooped up, taken back to England, immediately arrested, and put on trial for murder. The wild thing is, they didn't even try to deny what they did. They just claimed they did it out of absolute sheer necessity." Put yourself on that jury for a second. How on earth do you judge them? Well, the defense leaned completely into Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. First, they argued extreme necessity. 19 days starving at sea creates a level of desperation we can't even fathom. Second, they pointed to the pure math, sacrificing 1 single life to guarantee 3 survived. And third, they brought in the wider societal impact. The 3 surviving men were husbands and fathers. They had families relying on them back home. Richard Parker, he was an orphan on his very first voyage with literally no family to mourn him. From a cold, calculated view of societal happiness, the defense basically said, look, we maximized overall utility. So, if we want to poke holes in this horrific act, we really have to look at the objections. Let's start with the concept of due process. Remember how Captain Dudley wanted to do a lottery, but they didn't? Well, what if they had? If all 4 men sat down, agreed to a perfectly fair set of rules, and the cabin boy just happened to draw the short straw, does his murder magically become morally acceptable? For a lot of people, throwing a fair procedure into the mix actually does change the moral weight. It shifts it from a cold-blooded execution to a tragic but mutual sacrifice. But does a fair procedure really justify a lethal result? And that brings us right to an even trickier complication. What about consent? What if, as he was dying, Richard Parker had actually spoken up and explicitly consented? What if he volunteered to be a martyr to save the rest of the crew? For so many people analyzing this historical case, if the boy had genuinely offered his life, the act suddenly stops being murder and transforms into something entirely different. Picking apart this true crime tragedy leaves us staring down 3 absolutely unavoidable questions that challenge everything we think we know about consequentialist and categorical instincts. Number 1, do fundamental human rights exist totally outside of what benefits society? Because if murder is just categorically wrong, then the math of 3 lives versus 1 shouldn't matter at all. Number 2, why do we instinctively feel like agreeing to a fair procedure, like drawing lots, somehow changes the morality of someone getting killed? And number 3, what is the precise moral heavy lifting that consent is actually doing here? I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to just kind of rattle around in your head. Think back to the heavy man on the bridge, that poor napping patient in the hospital, and the sick cabin boy stranded in the lifeboat. Does an act of simple consent truly have the power to just erase the incredible moral weight of taking a human life? Does agreeing to be killed actually make the killing right?